Berlin, September 1939. In the marble glow of the Reich Chancellery, Hermann Göring rested his bulk against the edge of a polished table, one hand wrapped around the ivory head of his marshal's baton. The room smelled faintly of cigars and rain-damp uniforms, for outside the city was shrouded in a steady drizzle. Staff officers leaned forward as the Reichsmarshal, resplendent in blue uniform heavy with medals, tapped a map of the Ruhr with a manicured finger. He announced, with that mix of arrogance and charm that had become his hallmark, that no enemy bomber would ever penetrate German airspace. "If they do," he laughed, his jowls quivering, "you can call me Meyer." The laughter echoed across marble walls, bouncing between men who wanted to believe. At that moment, the boast was not unfounded. The Luftwaffe stood at its zenith. More than 4,000 combat aircraft in service, battle-tested in Spain, and now slicing across Polish skies with brutal efficiency. The Messerschmitt Bf 109E fighters, climbing faster than anything their enemies could field, cut apart Polish air defenses in days. German bombers like the Heinkel, He-111 and the Ju-88 turned cities into firestorms. To Göring and his coterie, air superiority seemed permanent. Across the Atlantic, the United States barely stirred. Fewer than 3,000 military aircraft rolled out of American factories that year, many already outdated. The Army Air Corps remained a token force, its doctrine still untested, its machines often dismissed by European observers as clumsy experiments. When Göring chuckled about Meyer, he wasn't simply mocking the idea of American bombers over Berlin. He was mocking the very notion that democracy's factories could rival totalitarian efficiency. What he did not see were sparks flying in Detroit and San Diego, where civilian engineers were already learning to adapt conveyor belts from automobiles to bombers. He did not hear Roosevelt's quiet insistence that American industry could be retooled at a scale history had never seen. He did not imagine that within 5 years, Willow Run alone would produce more B-24s than Germany could replace across its entire Luftwaffe fleet. The marble hall grew quiet again, aides scratching notes, the sound of fountain pens against paper. Outside, Berliners hurried beneath umbrellas, unaware that their Reichsmarshal's boast had planted a seed of irony that would outlive the war. German soldiers themselves would repeat the phrase, "Call me Meyer," with bitter laughter when Allied bombers darkened their skies. That night the rain thickened, washing across statues and monuments. Göring's boast seemed as unshakable as the Reich itself. Yet thousands of miles away in Michigan, riveters hammered through the night, sparks flying in factories that smelled of grease and sweat. The laughter of one man was already being answered by the roar of engines not yet born. Detroit, winter of 1940. The sound was different now. Where once the clang of automobile frames had echoed through Ford's cavernous halls, the noise had deepened into the metallic thunder of war production. Sparks leapt from welding torches. Rivet guns hammered in rhythm like machine gun fire. The air smelled of hot steel, oil, and cigarette smoke as workers in coveralls bent over assembly jigs that stretched farther than the eye could follow. This was Willow Run, the experiment that turned democracy's factories into the deadliest arsenal the world had ever known. President Roosevelt's December 1940 radio address had called for America to become the arsenal of democracy. For many, it had sounded like rhetoric. In Detroit, it became blueprint. Civilian engineers retooled entire production lines not for sedans, but for heavy bombers. By 1941, Ford's engineers had scaled up to a feat no other nation had attempted, building a 4-engine bomber not by hand in scattered shops, but by mass production. Willow Run became the largest factory under one roof in the world. At its peak, a brand-new B-24 Liberator rolled off the line every 63 minutes. The numbers bordered on the impossible. In 1943 alone, American factories produced more than 86,000 aircraft. Germany, straining every resource, produced fewer than 20,000. In less than a week, Willow Run alone could turn out more combat aircraft than Göring's Luftwaffe could replace in an entire month. Where the Reich relied on skilled craftsmen laboring in small workshops, America weaponized scale itself. The B-24 was ungainly compared to the sleek Bf-109 fighters that had dazzled Europe. Crews called it the flying boxcar. But its power lay in endurance and volume. With a wingspan of 110 feet and a range exceeding 2,000 miles, it could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs deep into occupied Europe. 10.50 caliber Browning machine guns bristled from its turrets, each capable of spitting more than 1,000 rounds per minute. Every aircraft carried not just a crew of 10, but the fingerprints of thousands of anonymous workers whose rivets, welds, and wiring bound democracy's promise into metal. On the floor of Willow Run, workers spoke in ordinary tones while shaping extraordinary machines. A riveter named Charles told a colleague that his brother was training to fly one of these crates. A mother of 3, Margaret, wiped sweat from her brow as she stitched wiring harnesses, knowing her eldest was already wearing khaki. Their stories repeated across thousands of stations. Each shift was more than labor. It was participation in a global war effort that drew no distinction between soldier and citizen. When the first completed B-24 rolled into the gray Michigan sunlight, workers gathered silently, watching the bomber taxi forward. Its aluminum skin gleamed like a mirror, catching the light of a winter afternoon. Above the clamor of the factory floor, its engines roared alive. In that sound lay the answer to Göring's boast. The Reichsmarshal had laughed at the thought of American bombers darkening German skies. Yet here was democracy's reply, a war machine built not on arrogance but on abundance. Romania, August 1st, 1943. Dawn spilled pale over the rolling wheat fields outside Ploiești. A horizon suddenly ripped open by the roar of hundreds of B-24 Liberators. The air trembled with their engines, and crews inside the aluminum fuselages gripped yokes slick with sweat, eyes scanning the horizon. They were flying at treetop level, mere hundreds of feet above the fields, to evade radar and anti-aircraft guns. This was Operation Tidal Wave, one of the most audacious bombing missions of the war, and the target was the heart of Germany's oil supply. For Addison Baker, leading the 93rd Bomb Group, every second was a test of nerve and skill. His bomber's right engine sputtered from flak damage, yet he refused to break formation. Flames licked at the fuselage behind him, acrid smoke filling the cockpit. The bomb bay doors rattled in anticipation. Baker's sacrifice, ensuring his plane reached the target before abandoning ship, would earn him the Medal of Honor posthumously. Around him, other crews faced the same calculus: survive or complete the mission, knowing both were unlikely. The statistics were staggering. Of 178 bombers launched, 54 were shot down. Nearly 500 men were killed or captured that day. German and Romanian anti-aircraft crews unleashed a relentless hail of 88mm shells, creating fireballs that tore through the morning sky. The sound of flak exploding so close it rattled the Liberator's fuselage became part of the landscape. The drone of engines mingled with the screams of twisted metal. Civilians on the outskirts, like Elena Ionescu, watched in horror as silver birds tore the horizon apart, smoke rising from fields and storage tanks alike. The acrid scent of burning oil clung to her clothes and hair for days. Yet amid the destruction, German repair crews worked feverishly. Luna-style efficiency meant that within weeks, refinery output partially resumed. Tactically, Operation Tidal Wave did not cripple Axis oil entirely, but strategically, the raid sent a signal no one could ignore. American crews would reach the Reich's lifelines, and they could endure losses that Germany could not. Each plane that limped home carried proof of America's industrial abundance, every bomber replacing dozens destroyed, every life lost leveraged against the enemy's finite resources. In Berlin, Göring reportedly scoffed at the casualties, but private memos suggested unease. The Reich's black lifeblood had been touched. Flames consumed storage tanks, turning the horizon red and black as if the earth itself were bleeding. For the first time, the Luftwaffe faced the reality that even their fabled air superiority could not protect vital resources. As night fell, Ploiești smoldered. Elena walked among scorched fields, smoke curling around her like a shroud. Overhead, stragglers of battered B-24s limped back across the Balkans, engines sputtering, crews counting miles like breaths. The Reich had not yet collapsed, but the first fissures had appeared. Somewhere in the distance, Göring's laugh from 1939 echoed ironically, a promise undone by American resolve, endurance, and an industrial machine capable of sustaining losses that would have shattered any other nation. Berlin, June 1944. Albert Speer sat alone at his desk, dim light from a desk lamp casting long shadows across charts and graphs strewn like battlefield maps. The room smelled of ink and paper, of exhaustion, and the faint tang of pipe smoke. Before him lay the lifeblood of the German war machine, detailed records of synthetic fuel production, transportation logs, and projected needs for the Luftwaffe and Panzer divisions. Every line and column carried a hidden truth. He had known it in theory for months, but now the numbers forced the realization. The Reich was bleeding fuel faster than it could replenish. The German war economy relied on synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Merseburg, Bleckhammer, and Brux, producing a combined 124,000 barrels per day at peak capacity. Speer crunched figures and realized that American bombers had already reduced output by as much as 40% at certain facilities. Even small repeated raids had cascading effects. Rail lines bombed, pipelines ruptured, storage tanks set ablaze. What had once been abundant now became precariously scarce. For the first time, Speer could see a direct correlation between American industrial output and German operational paralysis. Across Berlin, Göring still boasted publicly, but his aides whispered of vulnerability. Every pilot grounded for lack of fuel, every tank abandoned in the mud, every sortie canceled, was a symptom of this slow, invisible attrition. Speer drafted urgent reports to Hitler, warning that aviation fuel reserves would drop from 180,000 tons per month to fewer than 20,000 in months to come if Allied pressure continued. He framed it clinically, with charts, not emotion, but each bar and number represented lives and planes that might never return. The revelation was horrifying. America's production capability exceeded Germany's in every measurable category. One B-24 rolling off Willow Run contained the combined labor of thousands of workers, yet it could replace dozens of aircraft lost in raids that Germany had spent months building. The Reich, with all its technological sophistication, could not keep pace with a nation mobilizing for sheer volume. Speer recognized an uncomfortable truth. The war was beginning to tilt decisively in favor of the Allies, not because of German error alone, but because democracy's industrial system was unmatchable. Speer leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For decades, the Reich had prided itself on precision, efficiency, and ingenuity. Now it faced an adversary that weaponized abundance itself, turning riveters, welders, and assembly line operators into soldiers of production. Each bomb dropped by a B-24 carried not just explosives, but a testament to American capacity to endure, replace, and escalate. He made a note for Hitler. Continued attrition of fuel will soon ground the Luftwaffe entirely. Outside, Berlin's streets hummed with ordinary life, unaware that the war's decisive battles were being fought in factories far from the front. Speer exhaled and tapped a pen against the desk. The numbers told a story of impending collapse, and there was nothing the Reich could do to stop it. May 12, 1944. Dawn was thin and gray over the industrial heart of Germany. At the Leuna synthetic fuel plant, alarms screamed and flares lit the horizon as American bombers streaked across the sky. Precision daylight raids by the 8th Air Force transformed the facility into a war zone. High explosives tore through steel and concrete, incendiaries ignited storage tanks, and columns of black smoke stretched miles into the morning air. Workers ducked into shelters, soot and oil mixing into every breath. The plan was surgical but audacious. Over 200 B-17s and B-26s carried nearly 1,000 tons of bombs aimed at crippling the Reich's capacity to produce aviation fuel. Bombing doctrine emphasized accuracy, with each aircraft following strict headings and timing to overwhelm defenses in waves. Anti-aircraft crews fired relentlessly, yet the bombers pressed forward, guided by crews trained for months in navigation, formation flying, and bomb release timing. Many planes sustained damage, but very few turned back. From inside the control towers, German engineers scrambled to monitor explosions and protect vital machinery. Yet the sheer scale of the attack overwhelmed them. A single strike damaged pipelines that supplied entire production lines. Storage tanks erupted, consuming tons of petroleum in fire columns visible from 20 miles away. Emergency response teams worked frantically, but the combination of smoke, heat, and repeated bombing runs made repair nearly impossible. American crews, despite losses, could not be stopped. Even with dozens of planes lost to flak and fighters, replacements were already on the way. Willow Run and other U.S. factories continued producing B-24s at a rate unmatched in history. One factory in a single week could output more bombers than Germany had operational in its entire Luftwaffe at that moment. Every strike, every loss, demonstrated the terrifying arithmetic of industrial democracy. America could expend more than Germany could ever field. The human element remained vivid. Romanian civilians fled the outskirts, watching Luna erupt in smoke and flame. Airmen inside the B-24s later recounted the heat on their faces, the roar of engines combined with explosions, and the acrid odor of burning synthetic oil filling their noses. For many, the raid was both terrifying and exhilarating, a proof that courage and training could leverage industrial power to alter the course of war. By nightfall, Leuna smoldered. The Reich's engineers assessed damage. Temporary halts in production, disrupted supply lines, and a psychological shock that stretched to Berlin. Göring's officers began to whisper warnings privately, yet publicly the Reich maintained composure. For the Allies, the success reinforced a principle that would define the rest of the war: a democracy's ability to mobilize people, materials, and machines at scale could systematically dismantle the foundations of totalitarian power. Late summer, 1944. Oberleutnant Franz Müller, a veteran Luftwaffe pilot, sat on the frost-covered tarmac at Merseburg Airfield, staring at Me-262 jets lined up like silent trophies. Their sleek fuselages glimmered in the pale morning sun, engines cold, fuel tanks empty. Each aircraft represented months of effort, the pinnacle of German engineering. Yet the war had reduced them to immobile sculptures. Aviation fuel had dropped from 180,000 tons in March to fewer than 20,000 by November. Even these revolutionary jets could not fly without the lifeblood the Allies were systematically destroying. Müller's comrades whispered bitterly about Göring's boasts, repeating the phrase, "Call me Meyer," with a grim, ironic chuckle. Across Germany, fuel rationing crippled training schedules. Pilots were flying fewer than 20 hours a month, barely enough to maintain proficiency. Tanks sat in fields, trucks were immobilized, and entire Luftwaffe squadrons were grounded, waiting for supplies that would never arrive in time. Each day, Müller felt the slow strangulation of German air power, a crushing weight imposed not by enemy fire alone, but by American industrial might. American crews, in contrast, pressed relentlessly. Every B-24 and B-17 lost in raids could be replaced in weeks, if not days, a testament to factories producing aircraft faster than Germany could count them. Logistics became a weapon itself. One day's output of U.S. bombers could exceed Germany's monthly total. One day's loss to flak fully sustainable. The arithmetic of abundance was inescapable. Müller reflected on his training over the Eastern Front, the victories that once seemed decisive. Now, his skill mattered less than the fuel he lacked. Even the most advanced aircraft could not overcome scarcity. The Allies had turned production into strategy, every bomber a rolling statement that Germany's industrial model, brilliant though it was, could not match a free society's capacity to mobilize millions toward a singular purpose. By evening, the airfield was silent except for the occasional hum of a generator. Müller's gaze lifted to the horizon, where contrails of American bombers stretched like threads across the sky. He knew they would return. The Reich was still standing, but the war in the air had shifted irrevocably. One pilot, one engineer, one worker at Willow Run at a time, democracy was dismantling totalitarianism, not through brilliance alone, but through the overwhelming weight of its abundance. December 1944. Snow fell in slow, wet sheets across the Ardennes, clinging to trees and armored vehicles abandoned by German crews. In the muddy fields, Panther and Tiger tanks sat idly, engines cold, tracks sunk into frozen earth. Soldiers huddled inside, fuel gauges frozen at empty, cigarettes burning low. Oberleutnant Franz Müller stared at the idle machines and shook his head. The technical brilliance of German engineering, once feared across Europe, had been rendered irrelevant. The Allies did not destroy these tanks with superior firepower. They destroyed the fuel that made them move. Across the Atlantic, the contrast could not have been starker. At Willow Run, B-24s rolled off the assembly lines in relentless succession. Engines roaring, wings stretched wide, bomb bays ready to carry 8,000 pounds of ordnance. Riveters and welders worked around the clock. One single day's production of aircraft could replace multiple Luftwaffe squadrons lost to flak, a statistic so staggering it seemed impossible. Where Germany rationed oil and munitions, America poured resources into endless repetition. Each new bomber represented both a material weapon and a psychological one, an inexhaustible will to fight and win. On the battlefield, infantrymen felt the impact intimately. German panzer units, trained for decisive thrusts, ground to a halt because the fuel simply did not exist. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, faltered before it began. Where once strategy could overcome scarcity, scarcity now dictated strategy. American logistics and industrial abundance had turned the arithmetic of war into a weapon, rendering German planning futile. Müller walked past his Panther, the snow crunching underfoot, thinking of B-24 formations he had seen overhead during earlier raids. The bombers were more than aircraft. They were moving factories carrying not only bombs but the weight of America's industrial capacity, the thousands of hands and hours invested in each fuselage. A single bomber lost could be replaced. A single tank lost could never be fully compensated. The ratio was impossible. One day's American production could outstrip Germany's output for an entire month. By dusk, the sky above the Ardennes streaked with contrails from reconnaissance flights and returning bombers. The snow-covered battlefield lay in silent testament to the arithmetic of abundance. German soldiers realized that courage and skill alone could no longer overcome industrial supremacy. Democracy's factories had become the ultimate weapon, invisible yet decisive, turning frozen mud into monuments of futility. Leipzig, January 1945. Black smoke rose from distant refineries, curling over the city like a shroud. Civilians stumbled through streets lit only by flickering lanterns. Coal and petroleum shortages plunged entire neighborhoods into darkness. Ration cards dictated every ounce of fuel. The air reeked of smoke and scorched synthetic oil. Inside, mothers clutched children to their chests while the distant boom of American bombers reminded them that war had arrived again. Repeated Allied raids on Mersburg, Bleckhammer, and Brux had paralyzed production. Bombing doctrine had evolved, focused not on cities alone, but on the arteries that fed Germany's military machine. Thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries ignited pipelines, storage tanks, and machinery. Recovery required weeks, even months. Engineers worked feverishly, but each repair was temporary. American aircraft could return faster than Germany could fix the damage, a cruel rhythm demonstrating industrial might as strategy. Romanian civilians, like Elena Ionescu, watched flames stretch toward the horizon, the roar of explosions carrying over fields that had once been safe. Airmen in the B-24s recalled the heat on their faces and the acrid stench inside the planes as bombs were released. Every mission reflected a terrifying calculus. The Allies could lose dozens of aircraft in a single raid, yet their factories ensured replacements would follow immediately. One day of American production could exceed Germany's entire monthly output, a fact that would shock even the most seasoned Wehrmacht planners. In the Reich, Göring continued his public boasts, but private memos circulated with grim warnings. Pilots flew less than 20 hours per month. Aircraft sat idle due to fuel shortages. Entire Luftwaffe squadrons were grounded. Each raid demonstrated the invisible power of abundance. Logistics, not bullets, became decisive. By evening, Leipzig slept under an artificial night, the city suffocated by rationing and blackouts. Yet across the Atlantic, factories churned ceaselessly. Riveters, welders, and engineers worked shifts that blurred the line between day and night. Democracy's industrial system had weaponized the human workforce itself. The contrast was now undeniable. Scarcity ruled German skies, abundance ruled American. Smoke and flame were the visible signs, but the real weapon was capacity, the ability to endure, replace, and escalate. The Reich's infrastructure had been touched, its heart scorched, its people reminded that the arithmetic of war had already turned against them. December 1944. Snow blanketed the Ardennes forests, turning mud into treacherous ice. German tank crews shifted uneasily in their cold cabins, staring at gauges that refused to budge. Fuel levels hovered at zero. Tiger and Panther units, once symbols of armored might, were immobilized not by combat, but by the absence of gasoline. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's desperate gamble, had already faltered. Panzer columns stalled in silent frustration, vulnerable to infantry attacks and American artillery, yet untouched by direct combat. American forces pressed relentlessly. Infantry patrols discovered entire divisions immobilized, the engines of German tanks silent, their crews desperately siphoning what little fuel they could find from destroyed vehicles. Across the sky, B-24s and B-17 rumbled on missions to destroy the remaining synthetic fuel plants. One day's American production could field more aircraft than Germany had in total for the month, a statistic so staggering that even seasoned Wehrmacht officers found it almost unbelievable. Oberleutnant Müller, watching the frozen expanse, understood the arithmetic of defeat. It was not lack of courage or skill that was ending the offensive, but the unseen hand of industrial democracy. Where Germany rationed and repaired, America multiplied. The Allies did not merely strike, they replaced, escalated, and sustained in a way the Reich could never match. The war's momentum, once contingent on frontline heroics, now flowed from factories thousands of miles away. Soldiers scavenged for scraps of fuel, abandoned half-tracks and makeshift supplies, but the scale of American production made every act desperate and ultimately futile. Miller traced contrails of returning bombers across the gray sky. He knew they would return in larger numbers, each machine a rolling factory, a piece of democracy's enormous capacity made tangible in metal and human labor. By evening, the snow glimmered under a waning sun, tanks silent and crews hollowed by frustration. Across the horizon, distant fires from Allied raids burned as reminders that scarcity had become the ultimate battlefield weapon. For the German army, the arithmetic of abundance was now an immutable truth. Individual skill, technical brilliance, and bravery could not overcome a nation that produced exponentially, replaced losses endlessly, and transformed civilians into soldiers of industry. Berlin, April 1945. In a dim cell at Nuremberg, Hermann Göring sat hunched, handcuffed, staring at the walls that had once echoed his laughter. The phrase he had uttered in 1939, "Call me Meyer," now haunted him in bitter irony. Outside, Allied aircraft droned continuously overhead, the once mighty Luftwaffe reduced to impotent shadows of its former self. He had mocked American air power. Now, decades of hubris crumbled beneath the relentless arithmetic of production. Across Germany, prisoners of war whispered the same phrase with grim humor, an ironic echo of the Reichsmarshal's confidence. Soldiers who had once revered him now recounted in bitter amusement how American bombers, replacements endless and precise, had rendered entire squadrons immobile. The raids on oil refineries, transportation nodes, and production centers had ground Germany's war machine to a halt. The very engines that had powered tanks, planes, and trucks now stood silent, waiting for fuel that would never arrive. The scale of American industrial capability was staggering. By the time Luna, Mersburg, and Bleckhammer were repeatedly struck, the Allies had delivered tens of thousands of tons of ordnance, more than Germany could ever hope to repair in months. Every B-24 that survived carried not only bombs, but the weight of factories, workers, and logistics, a single machine, a microcosm of an entire national effort. Allied bomb tonnage on synthetic fuel targets alone exceeded Germany's maximum monthly production, a statistic that modern analysts still cite as impossible. For the civilians caught in this maelstrom, the war had become a test of endurance. Blackouts stretched across cities, rationing dictated survival, and the stench of burning petroleum lingered long after the raids. Yet, in American factories, workers kept building. Riveters, welders, and engineers did not pause. Their labor became an invisible artillery, each bolt and rivet delivering strategic consequences to distant battlefields. Göring's private notes reflected growing alarm. Aviation fuel, the lifeblood of his Air Force, had dropped by more than 90%. The Luftwaffe could no longer train pilots adequately, and operational sorties dwindled to near zero. Even the most technologically advanced jets, including the Me-262, were rendered irrelevant by the absence of fuel. The Reich had been undone not by a single strike, but by the continuous, cumulative power of industrial democracy. As night settled over Berlin, the distant roar of American bombers faded into memory, leaving Göring to confront the stark truth. His laughter had been premature, hubris replaced by the echo of inevitability. He had mocked an enemy whose greatest weapon was not cunning or doctrine, but the capacity to endure, replace, and escalate with precision. In that quiet, the Reich's failure became a lesson in the power of abundance. Washington, May 1945. Analysts from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey sifted through captured German records, fuel production charts, and Luftwaffe logs. The arithmetic of victory lay bare. From May 1944 to April 1945, synthetic fuel output fell by 90% across the Reich. Entire fighter wings were grounded, Panther and Tiger units immobilized, and operational planning rendered meaningless. American victory in the air was no longer theory, it was statistical fact. The survey quantified the impossible. One day of American production of B-24s and B-17 exceeded Germany's monthly output. One factory, Willow Run, produced more bombers in a week than the Luftwaffe had operational across the entire European theater at that moment. Casualty ratios on fuel facilities were staggering. For every bomber lost, thousands of tons of fuel had been destroyed or delayed, crippling Germany's capacity to wage war. Engineers like Albert Speer later testified that the fuel shortage alone had determined the collapse of German military operations by late 1944. On the human side, pilots recalled the heat, smoke, and flak during missions over Leona and Ploiești, and civilians remembered the smell of burning oil that lingered for miles. Every raid demonstrated the connection between individual courage and industrial capacity. Every rivet and weld in an American factory became a tangible contributor to victory. The survey revealed that the war was not merely fought with bullets, but with the ceaseless capacity to build, replace, and sustain. Strategically, the effect was undeniable. German offensives faltered because tanks could not move, planes could not fly, and logistics ground to a halt. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, collapsed not because of tactical misjudgment alone, but because industrial democracy had ensured inexhaustible pressure on every critical point. Where scarcity ruled German planning, abundance ruled American strategy. Analysts framed the lesson carefully. Democracy, properly mobilized, could wield production as a weapon more decisive than any single army. The United States had not merely fought the Axis, it had outproduced and outlasted them. The statistics told the story with clarity, yet behind each number lay the sacrifice of thousands of airmen, engineers, and factory workers whose work had reshaped history. By the end of the survey, the conclusion was inescapable. The collapse of the Reich had been accelerated decisively by American industrial might. One statistic, a single day's production surpassing a month of enemy capability, summarized the profound imbalance. The war had been won not just in battles, but in factories, boardrooms, and assembly lines where ordinary Americans transformed into the architects of victory. Ploiești, Spring, 1945. Elena Ionescu walked among charred fields and shattered refineries, the acrid stench of burnt petroleum still clinging to her clothes. The world she knew had burned, yet amidst the ruins was a lesson written in steel, fire, and smoke. The Reich's arrogance, symbolized by Göring's laughter in 1939, had collided with the relentless arithmetic of American production, and the result was total strategic collapse. Every bomb dropped, every factory rivet, every hour spent in a U.S. assembly plant had converged to produce an outcome that seemed impossible at the start of the war. German forces had been technologically formidable, disciplined, and relentless, yet they were undone by a nation that wielded abundance as a weapon. One day's American bomber production exceeded Germany's entire monthly output. Synthetic fuel had been destroyed faster than it could be replaced. Entire squadrons of pilots were grounded, their skill rendered irrelevant by scarcity. For veterans like Addison Baker, for pilots in the 8th Air Force, and for civilian workers in Detroit and California, the victory was both collective and intimate. Each act of courage, each bolt tightened, each mission flown, became a tangible contribution to the war's outcome. Even the dead were part of a legacy larger than any individual. a legacy of determination, innovation, and industrial supremacy. Göring, once confident, now embodied the consequences of hubris. His laughter had been silenced, replaced by reflection in a prison cell. Speer's calculations had been proven accurate. Without fuel, the Reich could not operate. The American system, democratic, abundant, and unrelenting, had reshaped the rules of warfare. The Allies had won not merely through strategy, bravery, or firepower, but through the persistent application of production, logistics, and human ingenuity. Elena gazed toward the horizon, where the last of the refinery fires flickered. The landscape bore witness to both destruction and triumph. The arithmetic of abundance had prevailed. The Reich's greatest boast, its technological prowess and discipline, had been no match for a nation capable of transforming civilian labor into decisive military power. The war had ended not in a single battle, but in the quiet, relentless work of millions whose collective effort shattered tyranny. As she walked through the blackened fields, Elena understood the lesson history had etched. Freedom, when paired with determination and industrial might, was unstoppable. The roar of American bombers had faded, but their legacy remained, etched in steel, smoke, and memory. The Reich's hubris had burned, and from its ashes emerged a world reshaped by the vision, sacrifice, and unmatchable power of American democracy.